I'm Chuck, he's Waddy, proprietors of the Lone Star Steakhouse and Saloon. Our health-minded marketing team says we ought to offer more food groups.
Yeah, well, you know, no food group.
I know, Waddy. Our mesquite grilled steaks come with steaming baked sweet potatoes and such, but they say we need fruit. Well, we got a rawhide Rita, Pecos peach, and beer with lime.
That's got to it. I
Come get a balanced meal at the Lone Star Steakhouse and Saloon. A nice thick slice of Texas.
Yeah.
Well, howdy there, pilgrim, and welcome to the Lone Star Steakhouse and Saloon. Don't worry, I won't attempt that accent for the rest of this video, I apologize, that was pretty rough. But the Lone Star Steakhouse and Saloon, which I am just gonna call Lone Star for the rest of this video for my own sanity, even though Lone Star is a fairly common name with different subtitles across restaurants and other various businesses, is a restaurant chain, and remained a single, independently owned and operated franchise specializing in, well, it's a steakhouse. Most of you probably know what a steakhouse is. Indeed, they offered steaks, as you might imagine, that was their specialty, but they also had burgers, seafood, and other offerings. As the name would imply, Lone Star's aesthetic was, well,
Texas?
very, very Texas. They were founded all the way back in 1989 by a man named Jamie B. Coulter. Coulter didn't get his start in the restaurant business with Lone Star. He'd been at it for several decades as a major franchisee of Pizza Hut. He had over 100 various Pizza Huts under his particular roster, but he was looking to expand into something else. In late 1989, he was invited to take a look at a new prototype restaurant that had been developed by a company called Creative Culinary Concepts, who just love alliteration apparently, and that was, indeed, the first Lone Star. The food offerings were meant to emulate grill pits that were popular in Texas in the late 19th century, and of course the aesthetic and decor was very, very Western style. American Western. Cowboys, you know how it is. And Coulter really liked it, so much so that he entered into a business arrangement with Creative Culinary Concepts in 1991. Within 7 months of that date, Coulter would open 4 additional Lone Stars, and they would see much success throughout the 1990s, reaching their peak at 267 different locations. Some of you may remember them, but they're not around anymore. What went wrong here? After all, it's not like steakhouses aren't common. There are plenty of other restaurant chains that do the exact same thing that Lone Star did. Why did they fail? Well, it was a few different factors. The traditional Texas-style steakhouse that Lone Star helped make popular is known for not just aesthetic, but overall style. The waiters were known for doing impromptu line dances, and of course the floor was littered with peanut shells, presumably to more effectively murder those with allergies, but it was just the way it was done. But for a while, this was a very popular way to do it. In order for Lone Star to become as big as they were, Coulter realized he needed to actually take the company public. He needed investors. So in 1992, Lone Star became a publicly traded company, with only 8 locations at that point. But they were generating $2.5 million in annual sales, which was pretty impressive. So there were plenty of investors willing to put their money with Lone Star. They hit their peak in the late 90s, but then slammed into a brick wall when it came to growth. And this was partially because of an oversaturated market. They weren't the only steakhouse on the block. They never had been, but they really weren't anymore. There was heavy competition from places like Texas Roadhouse and Outback Steakhouse. Outback was distinctive because while they were still a steakhouse, they were, well, Australian-themed, mates. And one of the things Outback did better than Lone Star did was marketing. Outback was really good at marketing, still are. For example, Outback pushed their offering of the bloomin' onion, which I'm sure plenty of you are quite familiar with. It's one of their most popular dishes. But the thing was, Lone Star had a very similar offering, except they could never figure out what they were gonna call it. They never settled on a constant name, whereas Outback always called it the bloomin' onion and ran with it. Lone Star kept shifting the name for theirs around, from Texas Tumbleweed to Texas Rose. They weren't pushing it in the way they should have, and they weren't remaining consistent. Another problem was their food, and this was probably one of the biggest issues, more than anything else. Because you might be saying, well, Outback is one thing, but Texas Roadhouse is still here. Why couldn't Lone Star do that? Well, outside of being outcompeted in the marketing department, they were also outcompeted in the quality department. Even as far back in the 90s when they were growing, they were starting to cut corners in quality. Some of the reviews from back then don't really paint a great picture of the food. I mean, it was fine, but it wasn't great. One got a pretty bad cut of salmon, which was swapped for a better one, but the fact they didn't get the better one in the first place was kind of alarming. And one critic ordered a filet mignon. He did not get a filet mignon. What he got was 3 separate cuts of low-quality sirloin that was held together with a toothpick and wrapped with charred bacon. When they complained about this, the manager did, in fairness, comp them for this lack of an actual filet mignon, and explained that the kitchen staff did that pretty often when they ran out of fillets. Which, okay, but why didn't you just say you were out of fillets? Why are you, that's still not okay. Granted, chains can vary depending on location. I'm sure we've all experienced bad service at one part of a large chain, where in other locations it's a lot better. It can vary quite a bit, and the larger a company is, the more difficult it is to remain consistent. So there is some leeway here, but it was still something that was bad for the overall look of Lone Star. It didn't help that towards the end of the 90s, the stock market wasn't very happy with them. They had made a ton of money from their investors, but they weren't really good at actually paying back their investors. Their stock market performance was always pretty bad, no matter how well they did. Even though they were expanding and seemingly successful, the stock price wasn't going up, it was going down. This got especially frustrating into the late 90s because the stock market was actually enjoying what was known as a bull market. A bull market is when the broad market index of stock prices rises 20% or more for at least 2 months. It's a period of great success for stockbrokers. But even though almost every other company was going up during this time, Lone Star stocks were still dropping. What? How? How would that possibly be? What were they doing that was so dumb? Well, it was their core business, really. They were screwing that up. The food quality was a problem, and then they decided that in order to maintain their existing profit margins, they were going to scale back on advertising, which is bad because your competitors are going ham on advertising, and they raised their prices. I'm sorry. So you're advertising yourself less, and you're raising prices on food that most would consider subpar. That sounds like a golden combination. A real winner, as it were. Coulter was also accused of mismanagement as well. While he was good at managing a restaurant, when it came to Lone Star, there seemed to be some suspect decisions he was making. For example, in the spring of '96, he himself sold off 1.2 million of his Lone Star shares, when the stock price was $44 a share. High for them at that point, but 4 years later, the price would plummet 85%, making it worth less than $7 a share. Effectively, what this looked like is that he had cashed out while cashing out was good, and then just didn't care after that. He was sued in 2001 and accused him and other board members of quadrupling their own personal earnings and padding future severance agreements, while at the same time the stock price of the company was still declining. A man by the name of Guy Adams pushed to replace Coulter as Lone Star's chairman of the board. Lone Star tried to sue him, but he ended up winning Coulter's board seat in a landslide vote. Coulter remained CEO, but he wasn't on the board anymore. And at first, this kind of helped. The stock price more than doubled, but the mismanagement had done a really good job of just not making them very popular. The market was still oversaturated, of course, and people just weren't going to Lone Star. If they wanted a Texas-themed steakhouse, most would go to Texas Roadhouse. The first thing they tried to do was go private and attempt to merge with an investment firm, but that deal fell flat. In 2002, their sales plummeted by $1.14 million. But they did eventually get their wish to go private. 4 years later, in 2006, they were bought out by Lone Star Funds, or LSF, which is a Dallas-based firm that, despite the name, didn't actually have anything to do with Lone Star Steakhouse. It just kind of wound up that way. And LSF did specialize in buying ailing businesses. They acquired the Lone Star Steakhouses for $600 million. Now safely into the private sector, they no longer had to worry about angry investors so much. They could focus on actually fixing their problems, rather than appeasing Wall Street. But just the following year, in 2007, the Great Recession would slam into the American economy. And that hurt a lot of businesses, and restaurants especially. Because the thing about a recession or a depression is that people have less money. And if they have less money, they're gonna be more careful with how they spend it. And the thing about restaurants is that it is an option. It's a leisure activity. While, yes, you do need to eat, it is more expensive to eat at a restaurant, generally speaking. Whereas if you cook at home, it is more cost-effective. So many Americans simply weren't eating out as much anymore. If they had been the kind of person to occasionally frequent a Lone Star, they certainly weren't doing it anymore. Under their new owners, they attempted to re-image themselves. Instead of the old Texas Roadhouse theme, they switched their theme to a more urban style, while still keeping the name Lone Star. Who made that decision? Updating your aesthetics is one thing, but changing your theme when your name is literally Lone Star? Because the new theming had basically none of the Texas and cowboy themes in the older restaurants. Not any. I understand re-imaging somewhat, but when your name is categorically associated with the state of
Texas!
You kinda can't escape from that. Cause I tell you what, if I'm going into a place called Lone Star, the host better be Jimmy Stewart and the chef better be John Wayne. My waiter better be Clint Eastwood or at least one of his many wives. Like, come on now! So yes, the reimaging did nothing to help them. That, coupled with the recession, meant they started having to close down locations at a fairly rapid pace. 26 underperformers were shut down in 2008. 27 more were shut down in 2009, and that continued over the next several years. In 2013, LSF opted to sell Lone Star again, as well as its sibling eatery, Texas Land and Cattle, to the Day Star restaurant group. And no, I don't know why every single company involved in this story at least has the word Star in their name. Like, what? Anyway, they tried their best to reboot Lone Star's fortunes, but there really wasn't much they could do. 14 more locations closed without any notice by the end of 2016. And that included the original location in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. With most of the chain finally shut down, Lone Star filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on February 13th, 2017. They attempted to restructure themselves, and they claimed that the remaining restaurants were sold to a new owner on July 31st, 2017. But later, the Chapter 11 was converted to a Chapter 7, liquidation, on September 7th, 2017. But some locations still stayed open, most because of the franchise setup. As late as August of 2019, there were still at least 4 locations, but as of now, there's only 1. But where could that be? Well, with a name like Lone Star, there could only be one solid bastion. One place, one location, where a restaurant like that, bearing the spirit of the great state of
Texas!
would happily be able to continue to exist. Of course, I am talking about Guam. Yep. Yeah, seriously. According to all sources, at least as of now, the last remaining Lone Star Steakhouse survives on the island of Guam. They seem to have survived through pandemic restrictions by offering takeout, delivery, and dine-in options. By January of 2021, they expanded that service to include curbside pickup, as many locations do. They are the only place that still bears the Lone Star Steakhouse and Saloon name, and likely it's gonna remain so, because the market's still pretty saturated with steakhouses. I don't think there's room for Lone Star anymore, and given how poorly they were managed, a return for them is highly unlikely. But you can go to Guam, though. That's still an option. Just saying. And with that, a special thank you goes to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Road Videos, Lord Off 444, Iserfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Redlion, NS Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite Josh Johnson, Caleb Rainwaters Prez Drenton, Master of None, Travis Dolinsky, JBL Explorers, Tommy Rossini, Ben Mikola, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mark Holding, Mr. Terevel, Hayden DeGrow, No, Kurt Forkum, Mr. Sleepy, Harry, Drew Debris, George Kenny, Kevin Wood, Liam Wright, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Hannah Bird, Duraushi, A Person 723, William Nemo, Dr. Racer 78, Shimasu, Metal for Life Guy, Andrew Bowen, Crimson Rose, Ryan Weofer, Jared Brussel, Zintac M, Boss K, Orange Glass, Andy, The Conceptualist, Acoletti, Ohio Trucker 1, Windy City Rails, John Vidiola, AET Museum, NJ 1969, Extra Special J, Jonathan Coco, Kieran Tibbetts, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.